An ancient emperor could send a warning across a continent faster than a horse could run. Long before electricity, the greatest empires on Earth were held together by silent communication systems, networks of light and sound that defied the limits of geography. By the end of this journey, you will understand how these invisible threads of information built and sustained history's most powerful realms. How did a simple column of smoke become a secret weapon of imperial control? And what happened when these networks of whispers suddenly fell silent? What does it truly mean for a civilization to be connected? Think of it as a game of whispers played across a mountain range. The silent communication systems of the ancient world operated on a brilliantly simple, yet devastatingly effective, principle. They were not about sending a full letter or a spoken story. Instead, they were about transmitting a single, urgent piece of pre-agreed information as fast as physically possible. The message itself was not carried, it was recreated over and over again, leaping from one vantage point to the next. This is the heart of the relay. Imagine you need to tell a friend a mile away that the coast is clear. You could run the whole way yourself, or you could stand on a hill, wave a bright flag, and have your friend, seeing your signal, wave an identical flag to someone else further down the line. The information travels at the speed of sight, not at the speed of your legs. These systems transform geography itself into a conduit. A beacon fire lit on a coastal watchtower did not need to burn its way inland. The news of its light simply jumped from peak to peak, a silent shout echoing across the valleys. The message was always simple, often just a binary choice: attack or retreat, friend or foe, storm coming or all is well. The complexity was not in the message, but in the flawless, coordinated network built to carry it. This foundational idea of relayed, coded signals is what separates a simple alarm bell from an imperial nervous system. And to see this nervous system in its earliest, most legendary form, we must look to the rolling hills of ancient Greece, where a single word born of fire could change the fate of a kingdom. The royal road was the central nervous system of the ancient world's first superpower. Under the Achaemenid kings, this meticulously maintained highway stretched for over 2,500 kilometers, connecting the glittering palaces of Persepolis to the distant shores of the Aegean Sea. It was an engineering marvel, but its true genius lay in the system it enabled. Mounted couriers, the empire's lifeblood, raced along this route in a relentless relay. They carried everything from tax records and royal decrees to intelligence reports and diplomatic correspondence. The Greek historian Herodotus immortalized their dedication with words that still echo today, stating that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stayed these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. This was more than poetic praise, it was a statement of imperial necessity. Information was the glue holding disparate provinces together, and its flow could never be allowed to stop. Yet a galloping horse, no matter how swift, has its limits. A detailed report on a provincial governor's activities could take weeks to travel from the empire's edge to its heart. For an emperor ruling a territory of such unimaginable scale, this created a dangerous vulnerability. What if a rebellion erupted in a distant satrapy, or an enemy army was spotted massing at a remote frontier? By the time a rider arrived with the news, it could already be too late. This is where historians believe the silent systems came into play, working in tandem with the physical road. While couriers carried the complex stories, a network of signal fires or polished mirrors likely transmitted the most urgent headlines. A sudden blaze on a mountaintop watchtower overlooking the royal road could leapfrog ahead of the fastest rider, carrying a simple, pre-arranged message: invasion or revolt. The road provided the deep, contextual narrative of the empire, while the beacons provided the instantaneous, life-saving alerts. This was the foundational model, the first great experiment in dual-speed imperial communication. It proved that to rule a continent, you needed both the whispering courier and the shouting flame. And as we will see, this concept would be taken to its absolute logical extreme, not on open plains, but amidst the cloud-shrouded peaks of the Andes. High in the thin air of the Andes, a different kind of relay was running. The Inca Empire faced a communication challenge that makes a flat royal road look simple. Their domain was a vertical world of jagged peaks, deep gorges, and shifting climates, a landscape where building a straight path was impossible. Yet, to govern this impossible terrain, they engineered a system of breathtaking elegance and efficiency. It was built on two pillars: the unmatched endurance of the human body and the silent language of knotted cords. The runners were called Chasquis. They were not mere messengers, they were elite athletes, trained from youth to sprint at altitude. They were stationed in small stone huts called tambos, which were placed every few miles along the extensive Inca road network. A Chasqui would wait, listening for the sound of the runner approaching from the previous station. Upon hearing the signal, he would step out, receive the message, and immediately begin his own sprint to the next tambo. This human relay could cover over 200 miles in a single day, a speed that would shame even the finest Persian horsemen on the flat royal road. But what were they carrying? Often it was a memorized verbal message, but just as often it was something far more intriguing: a quipu. A quipu is a collection of colored strings, often made from cotton or camelid wool, from which hang numerous smaller cords. The secret lies in the knots, the type of knot, its position on the string, and the color of the cord itself all held specific meanings. To the untrained eye, it looked like a tassel or a piece of abstract art. To a trained quipukamayok, a keeper of the knots, it was a detailed record. Through this system, a Chasqui could sprint from a remote mountain village carrying a quipu that recorded the exact count of llamas in the herd, the number of bushels of maize in the storehouse, or the tally of men eligible for military service. The runner was the living, breathing network, but the quipu was the silent, immutable data packet. It was physical information, immune to the distortions of memory or the fatigue of the messenger. This combination was the empire's administrative heartbeat. A governor in Cusco could know the precise resources of a province 1,000 miles away almost as quickly as we check a digital dashboard today. The system was so effective because it was perfectly adapted to its environment, using human resilience to conquer geography and a cryptic, portable code to ensure accuracy. It proved that a silent language did not need to be ephemeral like smoke. It could be held in your hand, a tangible thread connecting a mountain peak to an emperor's throne. And as we will see, the desire to make information permanent, to etch it into the landscape itself, would lead to one of history's most ambitious and enigmatic silent networks. While the Incas mastered the vertical world with runners and knots, another empire faced a threat that flowed like water across a flat, open plain. The Great Wall of China is often pictured as a solitary, silent barrier, a stone dragon sleeping across the mountains. But in its prime, it was anything but silent. It spoke in a language of fire and smoke. Dotting its length at the highest points within clear sight of one another stood beacon towers. These were not just watchtowers, they were signal stations, the firing synapses of the empire's vast nervous system. A guard in a remote tower spotting movement on the steppe had one duty above all: to translate what he saw into a visible cry for help. During the Ming Dynasty, this system was refined into a precise optical code. A single column of smoke or a lone beacon fire might mean a small enemy patrol was spotted. Two fires with two smoke columns could indicate a larger force. A major invasion, the worst possible news, would be signaled by a full, terrifying display of 4 fires and 4 towering plumes of smoke. The code grew even more sophisticated. By burning different materials like wolf dung or specially prepared fuel mixtures, they could produce smoke of different colors, adding another layer of specificity to the message. Imagine the scene from the capital in Beijing. An official on the city walls wouldn't hear the clash of swords or the thunder of hooves from 1,000 miles away. Instead, he would see the horizon begin to pulse with light. First one tower, then the next, each one igniting its beacons the moment it saw its neighbor's signal. A wave of urgent light would race across the empire, leaping from mountain peak to mountain peak faster than any horse or runner ever could. Within hours, the emperor and his generals would know the scale and approximate location of a threat that was still days or weeks of marching away. The wall was not just a shield, it was an immense optical telegraph, turning geography into a communication medium. It made the land itself speak, translating the chaos of conflict into a clean, binary language of safety or danger, of 1 fire or 4. This was silent communication at its most dramatic, turning the very sky into a parchment for urgent news. And it raises a profound question. What happens when your empire is not defined by static walls, but by the ever-shifting, trackless surface of the sea? For that answer, we must set sail for the ancient Mediterranean. The open sea presented a communication problem no road or wall could solve. For the Roman Empire, whose lifeblood flowed through Mediterranean trade lanes, controlling this blue wilderness meant mastering a new language of light. Their solution transformed coastal landmarks into talking beacons, while the famed lighthouse of Alexandria guided ships safely into port with its colossal fire. It was part of a wider, quieter conversation happening along the shore. Watchtowers stationed within sight of each other often employed a brilliant, simple technology, the heliograph. By angling a highly polished bronze shield to catch the sun, a sentry could flash a bright, focused beam of light directly to a ship or the next tower down the coast. This was not a vague glow on the horizon, it was a precise, directional signal. Think of it as ancient Morse code sent with sunlight. A series of deliberate flashes could convey pre-arranged messages, a warning of pirates in a nearby cove, instructions for a naval patrol to change course, or news that a grain shipment from Egypt had been sighted. This system turned the sun itself into a messenger for Rome. The light was instantaneous, silent, and required no fuel beyond a clear day. It represented a high point of optical engineering, where imperial will was communicated not with shouts or smoke, but with a calculated gleam of reflected sunlight. The lighthouse of Alexandria stood as the ultimate symbol of this power, a wonder of the world whose fire promised safe passage and whose very presence whispered that the empire was watching, connecting, and controlling. It proved that silent communication could be as focused and swift as a beam of light skimming across the waves. Yet, if light was the fastest possible messenger, what system could be built to harness that speed across not just a coastline, but an entire continent? One civilization sought to answer that with breathtaking ambition, creating a network where a complex message could cross 1,000 miles in the time it takes to read this sentence. A shimmering chain of fire could save a city. For the Byzantine Empire, the ultimate defense of their magnificent capital, Constantinople, was not just its legendary walls, but a network of light that stretched across the heart of Anatolia. In the 9th century, under the threat of rapid raids from the Abbasid Caliphate, they engineered what might be history's most sophisticated optical telegraph. The genius behind it is credited to a scholar named Leo the mathematician, a man who understood that in a race against cavalry, information had to move faster than any horse. His system was a masterpiece of simplicity and speed. A line of beacon stations was constructed from the mountainous border region of Cilicia all the way to the capital, a distance of over 450 miles. Each station was positioned within clear sight of the next, often on the highest available peak. The message was brutally simple, yet vitally important. It signaled one thing: an enemy invasion is crossing the frontier. Here is where the brilliance of the binary code came into play. Historians believe the system used two sets of beacons. The first chain was the alert line. When the frontier guards spotted a major enemy force, they lit their fire. The next station in line, seeing that flame, lit its own. This wave of light would race northward like a single, urgent pulse. But a single fire could be a mistake or a raid by a small bandit group. So, a second parallel line of beacons existed. This second line was only lit to confirm the message, to signal that this was indeed a major existential threat. The confirmed signal would then leap from station to station, following right behind the first. Imagine the scene in the palace in Constantinople. A watchman on the tower would first see the distant glow of the alert beacon on the Asian horizon. His heart would sink. Then, moments later, he would see the confirming fire ignite on the second line. That was the moment of certainty. The enemy was coming. From the moment the first flame was lit on the border to the moment the confirming light was seen in the capital, less than an hour would pass. A message had traveled the length of a modern country at the speed of sight. This was not just communication, it was a nervous system firing a pain signal directly to the brain. It gave the emperor and his generals a priceless gift: time. Time to shut the massive gates, to mobilize the army, to prepare the fleet. The survival of the empire, again and again, hinged on that silent, fiery shout racing across the mountaintops. It was the pinnacle of ancient optical signaling, proving that with enough coordination, a kingdom could shrink distance down to the time it takes for a flame to be seen. Yet, while light ruled the open hills and seas, other empires faced a different challenge, where vision was blocked by endless, towering trees. For them, the silent message had to travel not through the eyes but through the ears. But in a world of endless green, where one hilltop could not see another, light was a useless messenger. The vast rainforests of West Africa presented a problem that mountaintop beacons could never solve. Here, the silent system spoke not with fire but with rhythm. For forest kingdoms like the Ashanti and the Yoruba, the dense canopy that blocked the eyes became a perfect channel for the ears. Their solution was an instrument of breathtaking linguistic genius: the talking drum. These were often hourglass-shaped drums, held under the arm, with their pitch controlled by the tension of the leather cords connecting the two heads. A master drummer did not simply beat out a generic warning cadence. Instead, they replicated the very tones and rhythms of their spoken language. In tonal languages like Twi or Yoruba, where the pitch of a syllable changes its meaning, the drum could mimic those rising and falling patterns. The drum did not just say danger, it could say the danger comes from the river path or the traders from the north bring salt. It could recite proverbs, announce the birth of a child, or call a council to meet. A complex message, wrapped in the familiar cadence of speech, could travel from village to village through a relay of skilled listeners and drummers. In the deep forest, where a traveler might take a day to navigate a few miles of tangled trails, news could fly ahead in minutes, carried on the air. This was a network woven from culture itself. The code was not a secret cipher known only to soldiers. It was the shared language of the people, elevated to an art form. It turned the entire community into participants in a vast, living conversation. The forest was no longer a barrier to communication. It was the resonating chamber. This reminds us that these silent systems were never just cold, mechanical tools. They were deeply embedded in the worldview of the cultures that created them. They carried not only commands but identity, and to see how far this symbolic layer could go, we must look beyond practical messages to the signals that conveyed not just information, but raw, undeniable power. A single beacon fire on a distant hill held no meaning in itself. Its power came entirely from a shared, secret understanding. Every silent system, from the simplest smoke signal to the most intricate knot record, was built upon this invisible foundation, a pre-arranged code. A column of smoke rising in the morning might mean the harvest was beginning, while that same column at dusk could signal an approaching army. The signal was just the vessel, the code was the message inside. This layer of abstraction is what transformed basic elements into a sophisticated language. For the Inca, the Quipu was not a magical object. It was a physical database that only a trained Quipucamayok could accurately read and update. The position of a knot, the twist of a chord, the sequence of colors, these were all parts of a grammatical structure as complex as any written ledger. In the same way, the guards on the Great Wall or along the Byzantine beacon lines were not just lighting fires at random. They followed a precise protocol, a kind of optical grammar. 2 fires meant one thing, 4 fires meant another. A red smoke versus a black smoke could indicate the direction from which an enemy approached. These codes were among the state's most guarded secrets, as vital to security as any modern encryption key. In times of war, intercepting and deciphering an enemy's signal code was a prize beyond gold, a way to hear their plans whispered across the landscape before they could be enacted. The entire system relied on a fragile chain of human trust and flawless execution. A bored guard on a lonely tower, a tired Chasqui on a mountain trail, a drummer losing the rhythm. Any single break in focus could cause the entire network to fail or, worse, to lie. The silent systems demanded more than just engineering. They required immense organization and the deep, disciplined trust of every individual in the chain. This brings us to the most overlooked element of all, the people in the outposts. Who were the men who spent their lives waiting for a light to appear on a far-off peak? The silent shout racing across a mountaintop began with a single, lonely pair of eyes. These were the keepers of the flame, the human anchors of every imperial network. Far from the bustling capitals and royal courts, their world was one of profound isolation and unrelenting duty. A Byzantine sentry perched on a wind-scoured peak in Anatolia, an Inca Chasqui huddled in a stone tambo as a snowstorm howled outside, a Ming Dynasty guard staring into the empty vastness of the northern steppe. Their lives were defined by waiting. They were often soldiers, but their battlefield was a state of constant vigilance. Their enemy was not an invading army, but distraction, boredom, weather, and the creeping doubt that the light they just saw on the horizon was a trick of the mist. Their entire purpose was to be a flawless, living relay. A single moment of inattention could break the chain. Imagine the weight of that responsibility. A guard who dozed off or who misread the signal from the next tower could send a false alarm cascading toward the capital, mobilizing armies and draining treasuries for a threat that did not exist. Worse, he could fail to see a true warning, leaving the empire blind to a gathering storm. The consequences were severe. Historical accounts suggest that for an Inca Chasqui who failed to pass his quipu or message with perfect accuracy, the punishment could be dire, a reflection of how critically the state depended on the integrity of its information flow. Their daily reality was a grind of logistical precision. It was not just about watching, it was about maintaining the very means of communication. This meant stockpiling dry wood and straw for beacons, ensuring oil lamps were full and wicks trimmed, keeping polished bronze mirrors spotless, and in the case of the Chasqui, maintaining peak physical condition at high altitude. They lived according to strict, unforgiving protocols that left no room for interpretation. When the signal came, there was no time for discussion, only immediate, flawless execution. Light your fire, start your sprint, beat your drum. These individuals were the human nodes in a vast, distributed system. They never saw the big picture from their remote outposts, yet the empire's ability to function as a single, responsive entity rested entirely on their collective discipline. The grandeur of imperial unity was built on this gritty, lonely, and essential foundation. But to support this army of watchers and runners required more than just people. It demanded an investment in infrastructure so vast it physically reshaped the landscape itself. The silent networks were not born from ideas alone, but from a staggering commitment of labor and resources. To make a distant peak speak to its neighbor, an empire first had to conquer the peak itself. This was a logistical undertaking of almost unimaginable scale. Before the first signal fire could be lit, teams of surveyors had to traverse treacherous terrain, mapping sight lines across valleys and over ridges to ensure each beacon station had a clear, uninterrupted view of the next. Often, this meant constructing towers on the most remote, inhospitable high points imaginable. The stone for these watchtowers, the timber for their signal piers, and the supplies for their crews all had to be hauled up slopes where even pack animals struggled. For the Inca, building their tambo way stations every few miles along mountain paths required not just construction, but a constant resupply chain. Runners needed food, water, and shelter, which meant other communities were tasked with producing and delivering these essentials, creating a secondary economy just to sustain the communication system itself. The famous Royal Road of Persia was not just a path for couriers. It was the essential supply artery that kept the entire imperial idea alive, and maintaining its bridges, way stations, and surface was a perpetual, costly endeavor. The financial and human cost of these projects was astronomical, consuming taxes and labor for generations. Why would any ruler commit such vast treasure to a system of whispers? Because the investment was never just about sending messages. It was about manifesting control in the most physical way possible. By etching these lines of towers and roads into the wilderness, an empire transformed abstract territory into organized, monitored space. A nomadic herder seeing a Ming beacon tower on a once empty hill understood at a glance that a powerful, watching presence now claimed that land. The network was a statement written in stone and fire, a declaration that this place was seen, connected, and governed. This physical domination of the landscape served one ultimate, overriding purpose: to project military force with terrifying speed and precision. The silent signal was the first weapon fired in any conflict. While these networks projected a vision of imperial unity, their beating heart was not administration but raw military necessity. The ultimate strategic advantage in the ancient world was not merely having a larger army, but being able to move and concentrate that army with impossible speed. A rebellion erupting in a distant province was like a fire in a dry field. If you could not stamp it out immediately, it would spread and consume everything. A silent communication network provided the crucial first step, the alarm. But it was far more than just an alarm bell. It was a trigger for a prearranged, empire-wide response. Imagine a beacon fire flashing on the Byzantine frontier. That light did not just say enemy spotted. For the generals in Constantinople, it activated a precise, rehearsed protocol. It meant the 3rd Legion, stationed in a specific garrison 100 miles inland, was to mobilize immediately and march to a predetermined choke point. It meant coastal watchtowers were to alert the naval fleet to patrol certain straits. The signal did not carry complex orders. It simply activated a plan that already existed, turning a scattered defensive force into a coordinated machine in a matter of hours. This ability to shrink time and space gave empires a supernatural-seeming power to be everywhere at once. For the people living under its protection or its control, it created an illusion of omniscience that the distant emperor could see trouble and strike it down almost before it began. This psychological effect was a weapon in itself, deterring rebellion by making the state's reaction time feel instantaneous. But the military use of these systems was not purely defensive. For empires on the march, they were the essential tool of conquest. An advancing army pushing into unknown territory faced a terrifying problem: the fog of war. How do you keep a 10,000-strong force supplied when its supply wagons are days behind? How do you receive new orders from the capital when you are crossing a mountain range? Silent networks provided the tether. A conquering force would establish a line of communication back to its base using runners, riders, or relayed signals. This allowed a general to send for reinforcements, to report victories, to bolster support at home, and most critically, to maintain a lifeline for food, weapons, and information. It turned a vulnerable, extended column into a connected limb of the empire, still feeling the pulse of command from the heart. The network reduced the general's greatest fear, isolation. He was never truly cut off. This flow of information, however, was not a one-way street out from the capital. The same channels that carried commands also carried back whispers from the edge of the world, the first whispers of what we would call intelligence. The same channels that carried commands back to the frontier also carried whispers from its edges. A silent communication network was never just a megaphone for the capital. It was a vast, distributed set of ears. While an emperor could shout an order across a continent, the true power lay in the quiet, constant murmur of information flowing the other way. A guard on a lonely tower was not just a signalman, he was a scout. A Chasqui running from a remote village was not just a courier, he was a data stream on two legs. Through these channels came the lifeblood of imperial administration, the raw numbers and observations that turned territory into something that could be governed. A Quipu arriving in Cusco was not a mystery, it was a spreadsheet. It told the Sopa Inca exactly how many bushels of maize were harvested in a valley he had never visited, how many young men were coming of age for labor or military service, and how many llamas were in the royal herd. This was quantitative intelligence, precise and portable. Similarly, a beacon fire on the Great Wall might signal an invasion, but the detailed report following days later by Courier would contain the qualitative details, the size of the enemy force, the direction of their march, the condition of their horses. This two-way flow created something revolutionary, a form of real-time awareness. An emperor in his palace could, in a sense, feel the pulse of his empire. He could know that a drought was crippling the southern provinces before famine sparked revolt, because the reports of diminished grain stores would arrive via the relay system. He could detect a corrupt governor skimming taxes because the Quipu records from the province would no longer match the tribute arriving at the capital. The network became a sensory organ for the state, stretching its perception far beyond the walls of the palace. This constant, quiet surveillance was the ultimate tool of control, allowing problems to be identified and resources to be allocated with an efficiency that felt almost modern. Yet this remarkable awareness came with a profound and unavoidable fragility. The entire system, this grand illusion of omniscience, was built on a chain of human trust and environmental chance that could be broken by a single moment of fog, a solitary act of betrayal, or simply the slow, grinding decay of neglect. A clear night was the silent network's only guarantee. For all their engineering marvel and strategic genius, these systems possessed a profound and inescapable fragility. Their greatest strength, the reliance on the natural world, was also their ultimate vulnerability. A bank of fog rolling in from the sea could render a coastal heliograph station blind, severing a naval command chain as effectively as cutting a rope. A heavy rainstorm could drench beacon piers and obscure sight lines, plunging an entire frontier into informational darkness just when it was needed most. Even the smoke signals themselves could become a liability, as shifting winds might blow a warning plume away from the watching eyes of the next tower, leaving a deadly gap in the chain. The environment that carried their messages could, without warning, become a wall of silence. This physical vulnerability was matched by a human one. The entire concept of a relay depended on flawless execution at every single node. A guard suffering from exhaustion or illness might misinterpret the signal from a distant peak, lighting his fire for a major invasion when only a small scouting party had been spotted. This single error would then propagate down the line, triggering a costly and unnecessary mobilization. Worse than simple error was the threat of deliberate sabotage. An enemy force moving with stealth could capture a key beacon tower not to destroy it, but to turn it against its builders. By lighting the fires themselves, they could send a false, all-clear signal deeper into the empire, lulling defenders into complacency while the real attack gathered force just over the horizon. The network designed to provide ultimate security could, in a moment of betrayal, become a weapon used to orchestrate its own downfall. Beyond the risks of weather and human failure lay a more fundamental limitation: the simplicity of the message itself. These systems traded complexity for speed. A beacon fire could scream danger, but it could not whisper details. It could not convey whether the approaching force was 500 cavalry or 5,000 infantry, whether they were fresh or weary, whether they were led by a brilliant tactician or a reckless chieftain. For that depth of understanding, the empire always had to wait. The swift, silent shout across the mountaintops had to be followed by the slower, more vulnerable, but infinitely more descriptive report carried by a courier on horseback or a runner on a mountain trail. The silent system was the empire's adrenaline spike, its reflexive jerk away from a hot stove. The courier system was its conscious brain, analyzing the burn, planning the treatment, and learning from the experience. This duality was not a flaw, but a design feature of necessity. No single system could do everything. The brilliant alarm bell needed the detailed report to give its warning meaning and context. The fast network and the slow network existed in a symbiotic relationship, each covering the other's weaknesses to create a more resilient whole. Appreciating these limitations helps us see these ancient empires not as monolithic entities with perfect control, but as adaptive organisms constantly balancing speed against accuracy, immediacy against depth. They built ecosystems of information where light, sound, human endurance, and written word all played interconnected roles. And just as an ecosystem in nature begins to fray when its key connections break down, the collapse of these communicative networks often provided the earliest, most telling sign that an empire itself was beginning to unravel. A silent network does not fail with a single crash. It erodes one neglected tower at a time. The fate of these extraordinary communication systems was always bound to the health of the empires that created them. They were not self-sustaining, they were expensive, high-maintenance organs of the state, requiring constant investment in manpower, materials, and logistical support. As an empire's central authority began to weaken, often strained by internal conflict, economic strain, or a series of weak rulers, funding for the remote outposts was often the first expense to be cut. Why pour gold into a beacon tower on a distant, wind-swept peak when there are riots in the streets of the capital? The result was a slow, quiet unraveling. Stone watchtowers, once meticulously maintained, began to crumble. The tambo way stations along the Inca roads were abandoned, their roofs caving in. The stockpiles of dry wood for signal fires rotted in the rain. But the decay was more than physical. The specialized, guarded knowledge required to operate the system began to fade. The master Quipu who could read the complex knot records might pass away without training a successor. The precise protocols for beacon signals, once drilled into every guard, became confused and forgotten. The network, a living symbol of imperial unity, began to fracture into disconnected, silent segments. This breakdown created a vicious cycle with devastating consequences. As the communication lines went dark, the capital became increasingly isolated from its provinces. An emperor in Constantinople or Cusco would no longer receive the steady stream of data that had once allowed him to govern with such precision. He was governing in the dark. Provincial governors, no longer feeling the immediate presence of central authority, began to act more like independent rulers, withholding taxes or raising their own armies. Crises that once would have triggered an instantaneous, coordinated response now festered. A rebellion on a distant frontier might not be known in the capital for weeks, and by the time a response was organized, the rebellion had grown into a movement that could not be contained. The silent system's failure was both a clear symptom and a powerful accelerator of imperial fragmentation. It was a feedback loop of decay, where the loss of communication made the empire harder to govern, which in turn led to further neglect of the very systems that enabled governance. Historians can often trace the decline of an empire by following the points where its communication network began to fail, a unique map of decaying control written in abandoned watchtowers and overgrown relay roads. Yet, even as these specific systems faded into history, the fundamental idea they represented, the need to conquer distance with speed, refused to die. Its echoes would resonate in surprising forms long after the last beacon fire had cooled on a forgotten hilltop. The flicker of a beacon fire on a dark hillside would one day become the steady, mechanical click of a wooden arm. As empires rose and fell, the core principle of relayed silent communication did not vanish. It simply found new forms, evolving to meet the needs of new kingdoms. In medieval Europe, the ancient language of fire was still the fastest way to shout across a realm. When the Spanish Armada, that great fleet of warships, was sighted approaching the English coast in 1588, a chain of beacon fires was lit from the southern cliffs. One by one, these signal pyres burst into life, their light leaping from hilltop to hilltop, carrying the urgent warning deep into the heart of England, rallying defenses and mustering the militia long before any ship could bring the news. It was the same Byzantine tactic, employed for the same desperate purpose, national survival, but the desire for more than a simple yes or no signal, for the ability to send detailed orders or complex reports at the speed of sight, drove the next great leap. In the late 18th century, in a France gripped by revolution and war, a man named Claude Chappe achieved a breakthrough. He created the first true optical telegraph network, a system he called the Semaphore. It was a direct descendant of the mountaintop beacon, but with a crucial mechanical upgrade. Instead of a simple fire, Chappe's towers featured a large wooden apparatus with two pivoting arms and a central bar. By positioning these arms into hundreds of distinct configurations, operators could encode letters, words, and even whole phrases. A trained observer at the next tower, perhaps 10 miles away, would read the configuration through a telescope, then replicate it exactly on his own apparatus, passing the message down the line. This was no longer a binary shout of danger, it was a conversation. A complex message could travel from Paris to the distant city of Lille, a distance of over 130 miles, in just under an hour, a speed that seemed almost magical. These semaphore lines, built across Europe and later in other parts of the world, represented the final, most sophisticated form of silent communication before electricity changed everything. They were the ultimate bridge between the ancient and the modern, a network of wooden arms and human eyes that turned geography into a vast mechanical switchboard. The code was no longer in the color of smoke, but in the precise angle of a beam against the sky. This evolution reveals a relentless human quest, not just for speed, but for clarity and complexity at that speed. Yet for all their mechanical elegance, these swift networks still operated in a world dominated by a slower, more enduring counterpart, a counterpart that carried the weight of law, love, and legacy. To understand the full picture of how empires spoke, we must now listen for the steady, patient rhythm of the courier, the runner who carried the story that the light could only hint at. A sealed scroll carried the weight of law, while a beacon fire carried only a cry of alarm. The silent systems we have explored were not replacements for the courier, they were his essential, faster counterpart. An empire ran on two distinct speeds of information, each with its own purpose and power. The mounted messenger, galloping along the royal road or the Inca trail, was the bearer of complexity. In his saddlebag rested the nuanced treaty, the detailed tax assessment, the personal letter from a governor, the secret diplomatic dispatch. These were the dense packets of imperial data, confidential, legally binding, and rich with context. They could be sealed, encrypted through language, and delivered directly into the hands of a specific official. This was the empire's deliberative voice, the slow, careful process of governance and diplomacy. It could take weeks, but it carried the full story. The beacon fire, the drumbeat, the flash of a mirror operated on an entirely different principle. It traded all complexity for pure, breathtaking speed. Its message was a single, public bit, a pre-arranged symbol understood by all who saw or heard it. Attack all clear, enemy sighted. There was no nuance, no confidentiality, no room for interpretation. It was the Empire's reflexive shout, a biological impulse fired across the landscape. One system was for contemplation, the other for immediate reaction. They were not in competition, they were complementary technologies woven together to form a resilient informational fabric. The beacon provided the instant, life-saving alert, and the courier, already en route or dispatched immediately after, would follow with the detailed instructions, the explanations, and the legal authority to act. The light told you to pick up your sword, the scroll told you where to march and under whose command. This ancient duality feels strangely familiar. In our own digital age, we live with the same layered protocol. A push notification on your phone is the modern beacon fire, a brilliant, urgent flash that tells you something requires attention now. The email or document you open afterward is the courier's scroll, carrying the full depth and detail. The alert is public, simple, and fast. The follow-up is private, complex, and slow. We have instinctively recreated this two-tiered system because it answers a fundamental human need, the need to separate the urgent signal from the meaningful story. The genius of the ancient empires was recognizing that no single method could serve every purpose. They built ecosystems of information where light, sound, human endurance, and the written word each played a specialized role. Their ingenuity challenges a modern assumption that faster always means better. They understood that true connectivity requires both the shout and the whisper, the instant pulse and the patient narrative working in concert. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by the constant pings and alerts of the modern world, remember the watchman on the lonely tower. His entire purpose was to listen for one crucial signal amidst the silence, knowing that the full story was already on its way. The final flicker of a semaphore arm was soon replaced by the steady hum of an electric wire. Yet the ghosts of those ancient networks still whisper to us, not as obsolete curiosities, but as profound mirrors for our own hyper-connected age. We live in a world where a message can circle the globe in milliseconds, a feat that would have seemed like pure magic to a Byzantine signalman or an Inca Chasqui. It is easy to assume that true connectivity is a modern invention, a gift of silicon and satellite. But these silent systems from the past challenge that vanity. They reveal that the burning drive to overcome distance and time is not a product of the digital era. It is a fundamental human and imperial impulse. The Romans did not accept that the Mediterranean Sea meant isolation. They made it speak with flashes of light. The Inca refused to let the Andes Mountains create silent, independent valleys. They bound them together with runners and knots. The core desire is the same, only the tools have changed. Their solutions offer timeless lessons in elegant, resilient design. Each system was a masterpiece of adaptation, meticulously tailored to its specific environment. You would not use a talking drum in the open steppe, nor a beacon fire in a dense rainforest. They worked with the landscape, not against it, turning obstacles like mountain peaks into assets. This principle of environmental fit is crucial for any network, ancient or modern. Furthermore, these systems understood the vital balance between simplicity and redundancy. The binary code of a beacon fire, friend or foe, was simple enough to be executed flawlessly under extreme stress, and the network itself was built on redundancy, multiple towers in a line, so if one failed, the message could potentially jump the gap. The human operator was never an afterthought. They were the critical, trained node upon which everything depended. A bored guard or an exhausted runner was the single point of failure. Our own digital networks, for all their complexity, still grapple with these same issues: environmental limits, signal simplicity, redundant pathways, and the human factor in maintenance and security. Perhaps the most powerful reflection is this: communication infrastructure is never neutral. Building a line of beacon towers or a highway of tambos was not a public utility project. It was a profound exercise of power. It physically etched the authority of the state into the wilderness. It declared, this land is seen, this land is connected, this land is governed. The network was the primary tool for imperial cohesion, the literal and metaphorical thread that tried to weave 100 different peoples into a single tapestry called an empire. It centralized control by monopolizing the fastest means of sharing information. This should make us pause and look at our own digital landscapes with new eyes. The platforms and cables that connect us are also exercises of power, shaping what we see, how quickly we see it, and who gets to speak. The ancient world reminds us that to build a network is to build a certain kind of order. All of this leads to a fascinating, lingering question about the nature of language itself. We have called these systems silent codes, but could they be something more? Could the intricate knot patterns of a quipu, with their positional grammar and symbolic colors, be considered a true, albeit limited, form of three-dimensional writing? Could the precise sequence of drumbeats that mimic tonal speech be seen as an auditory script? These were not writing in the traditional sense of symbols on a page representing sounds or ideas directly. But they were systematic, rule-based methods for encoding and transmitting complex information across space and time. They fulfilled the core function of writing, to store and communicate data beyond the moment of speech. In a world without paper, they invented their own durable languages of fiber, fire, and sound. They challenge us to expand our definition of what it means to write a message, to record a thought, or to send a piece of a civilization whispering into the future. The quipu rests in a fascinating gray area between memory aid and true script. For generations, scholars viewed it primarily as an accounting device, a brilliant but limited tool for recording numbers. A specific knot might represent 10. Its position on the string could denote a category like livestock, and the color of the cord might indicate the region it came from. This alone made it a powerful three-dimensional database, a physical spreadsheet that could be read, updated, and archived. But recent research suggests its capacity may have been far greater. Anthropologists like Sabine Heil, and after studying quipu from remote Andean communities that still preserve the tradition, propose that some of these knotted cords could encode narrative information, stories, or even elements of phonetic sound. The type of fiber, the direction of the spin, the intricate combination of colors and knots, all might have formed a rich, tactile grammar capable of recording laws, histories, or genealogies. If this is true, then the quipu was not merely a calculator. It was a library made of string, a form of writing that you could hold in your hand and feel beneath your fingers. This challenges our very definition of writing, which we often limit to marks on a flat surface. Perhaps writing is not about ink and paper, but about any systematic, stable method of storing complex thought outside the human mind. By that expanded definition, the quipu stands as a monumental intellectual achievement, a silent language woven from the landscape itself. Yet, at the other end of the spectrum, the beacon fire and the talking drum represent a completely different principle. They were languages of pure immediacy. A drumbeat echoing through the forest carried meaning, but only for the brief moment it traveled on the air. Once the sound faded, the message lived on only in the memory of those who heard it. A column of smoke was a powerful sentence written against the sky, but the wind would erase it in minutes. These were performative, ephemeral acts of communication, brilliant for coordination but useless for permanent record-keeping. So we see a spectrum emerging. On one end, the Quipu leaning toward archival storage, a permanent record meant to endure. On the other, the beacon and drum leaning toward real-time transmission, a fleeting command meant to trigger immediate action. Most empires utilized points all along this spectrum, understanding that different problems required different tools. This intellectual diversity in their administrative toolkit is what we should truly marvel at. They were not just sending messages, they were carefully choosing the medium, weighing permanence against speed, public broadcast against confidential record. This sophisticated media ecology forces us to appreciate ancient governance as a deeply thoughtful, adaptive process. But this world of imperial signals and knotted records was not an abstract system, it was the lived reality for millions. How did the farmer in his field or the weaver in her village experience this web of silent commands stretching over their lives? The horizon itself could speak, and its voice was the law. For the farmer tending his field in a far corner of the empire, the sudden bloom of fire on a distant mountaintop was not merely a signal, it was a direct message from a power he might never see. His entire understanding of the world beyond his village was shaped by these silent systems. They translated the abstract, intimidating idea of an emperor or a capital city into something he could see with his own eyes and hear with his own ears. The knowledge that a threat spotted at the border could summon soldiers from a garrison days away was deeply reassuring, a promise of security woven into the landscape. Yet that same knowledge carried a quieter, more constant message. It meant his actions, his harvest, his very community were connected to a watching center. The beacon tower was not just a tool, it was a permanent symbol, a stone sentinel that made imperial authority as real and present as the hill it stood upon. This psychological effect was the silent network's most pervasive power. It cultivated a shared awareness, a collective understanding that everyone, from the lowest farmer to the highest governor, was part of a single, vast organism that could feel pain at its edges and react with terrifying speed. For some, this inspired a profound sense of belonging to something greater, a civilized order that kept chaos at bay. For others, particularly those in conquered territories or those chafing under heavy taxes, that same flicker of light on the ridge could feel like the unblinking eye of a master, a reminder that resistance was futile because news of any unrest would outrun the rebels themselves. The system engineered compliance not just through the promise of protection, but through the quiet, omnipresent threat of swift retribution. This duality, protection and control, is why these networks left such a deep imprint on culture and story. They became embedded in myth and folklore. Legends grew around the loyal guards who kept their watch until the end, or the clever spies who learned to mimic the enemy's drum codes. The systems themselves took on a kind of magical quality in the popular imagination, becoming symbols of a kingdom's reach and its mysterious, almost supernatural ability to know what happened in the most remote corners of the land. They shaped how people thought about distance, time, and their own place within a larger world. The silent network was therefore far more than an administrative tool. It was a narrative device, a constant, visible plotline in the story of the empire, telling every citizen, in a language beyond words, exactly where the power resided and how far its whisper could carry. The signal fire blazing in a Greek epic was more than a plot device, it was a cultural memory. When Homer described the beacon fires announcing the fall of Troy in the Iliad, and when Aeschylus, centuries later, dramatized the fiery relay bringing the news from Troy to Mycenae in his play Agamemnon. They were not inventing fantasy. They were weaving existing, awe-inspiring technology into the fabric of myth. In these stories, the silent system becomes a character in itself, a manifestation of fate and a symbol of inescapable connection. The chain of beacons does not just carry news, it delivers destiny, linking a victory on a distant shore to a terrible homecoming with terrifying speed. This literary legacy reveals how deeply these technologies captured the human imagination. They represented the ultimate compression of time and space, an idea so powerful it transcended their practical use to become a universal metaphor. We see this trope endure and evolve across millennia. In J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, the lighting of the beacon fires of Gondor is one of the saga's most cinematic and emotionally charged moments. It is not a simple alert, it is a call to ancient alliances, a visual plea that rekindles hope and summons aid from the remote mountains. The sequence thrills us because it taps into that ancient understanding that a flame on a peak can change the course of history. Similarly, the ominous drumbeats echoing through jungle adventures, signaling the movement of unseen forces, draw directly from the real-world talking drums of West Africa. In narrative, these sounds become the voice of the wilderness itself, mysterious and urgent. These enduring motifs preserve the emotional truth of the technology. For the people who lived with them, a beacon being lit was a moment of collective breath-holding. A drum pattern was a sentence that decided a village's next action. Literature freezes that moment, imbuing it with majesty, dread, or triumph. It reminds us that every signal fire was a drama, a human decision made in isolation that would ripple across a kingdom, altering countless lives. The stories ensure we remember the feeling, not just the function, but beyond the powerful stories and the fading legends, what tangible proof do we have that these intricate systems truly existed? A silent network leaves its signature in the stones it leaves behind. The physical remnants of these systems are often subtle, requiring a detective's eye to interpret. You will not find a row of intact towers, flags still flying. Instead, archaeologists uncover the ghostly outlines of their foundations, circles or squares of tumbled stone on a lonely hilltop that once held a Roman signal station or an Inca tambo. The story is written in the landscape itself. Modern researchers use geographic information system mapping to analyze the alignments of these sites, confirming that a beacon on one peak would have had a clear, uninterrupted line of sight to the next, proving these were not random watchposts but carefully positioned nodes in a deliberate chain. Sometimes a rare artifact speaks directly. A quipu, preserved for centuries in the dry air of a desert tomb, is a priceless discovery, a tangible piece of the empire's administrative voice waiting to be decoded. But such direct evidence is exceptionally rare. More often, the proof is indirect and requires a scholar's patience to assemble. It lives in the writings of ancient historians like Herodotus describing the Persian couriers, or Procopius detailing the Byzantine beacon lines. It is hidden in fragmentary administrative records, clay tablets or parchment scrolls that mention the allocation of firewood for watchtowers or the rations for relay runners. This is a patchwork of clues, a puzzle where the pieces are scattered across disciplines. An archaeologist's survey, a historian's translated text, and a geographer's topographic map must all come together. Each new identified beacon tower location is a triumph, a concrete point plotted on our map of the ancient mind. It transforms a lonely pile of stones back into a living station, a place where a real person once squinted at the horizon, waiting for a spark of light. As we slowly reconstruct these networks, stone by stone and text by text, we gain insight into something far greater than ancient engineering. We begin to understand the imperial imagination, the sheer will required to visualize a continent not as separate places, but as a single, connected entity that could be made to speak with one voice. This act of reconstruction forces us to ask a deeper, more haunting question about all human connection. A silent network was the physical expression of a single, unifying thought. Behind every beacon tower and every relay station lay a profound psychological drive, a mindset that viewed the entire known world as a project to be organized. This was the imperial will to connect, an obsessive desire to pull every distant province, every mountain valley, every remote shore into a synchronized orbit around a central power. It was not merely about sending messages faster, it was about erasing the very idea of distance as a meaningful barrier. For an emperor gazing at a map, those blank spaces between cities were not empty, they were threats, zones of silence where independent thought and rebellion could fester. The communication network was the solution, a web of light and sound designed to eliminate those silent zones. It imposed a single, imperial time on lands that had once kept their own rhythms. A rebellion in the morning on the eastern frontier would be known in the western capital by that same afternoon, collapsing weeks of local time into a single, urgent imperial moment. This drive for centralization required a breathtaking level of investment, consuming resources that could have built monuments or funded lavish courts. Why pour such treasure into a line of lonely stone towers? Because the network was more vital than any palace. A palace housed the ruler, but the network was the ruler's extended nervous system, the tool that allowed one mind to theoretically feel and direct a continent. It was the ultimate non-utilitarian project that was, in fact, supremely utilitarian. Its function was control, but its form was ideology made visible. Each tower standing sentinel on a wild hill was a statement carved into the earth itself, declaring that this place was seen, counted, and irrevocably bound to a center. This mindset explains the monumental scale. It was not enough to have a few signal fires, the chain had to be unbroken. It was not enough for runners to cover some of the trails, they had to cover all of them. The goal was totalizing, to weave a seamless fabric of awareness where no thread could come loose. This relentless will to homogenize space and time, to make the empire function as a single, manageable entity, finds perhaps its purest expression in one final, sprawling case study. To see this imperial psychology operating at its most ambitious, we must journey to a desert empire where the messengers did not run along roads, but across a landscape of sand and stars. Across the vast, wind-swept steppe, the horizon was a line of endless grass. For the Mongol Empire, which conquered more land than any other in human history, this presented a unique challenge. There were no mountain peaks for beacons, no stone roads for runners, only an ocean of open space. Yet they mastered it with a system of breathtaking efficiency, built not on stationary towers but on relentless motion. At the heart of their control was the Yam, a network of relay stations spaced a day's horse ride apart. These were not grand fortresses, but simple outposts stocked with fresh horses, food, and supplies. A mounted courier carrying a sealed message or a verbal command from the Great Khan himself would ride at a punishing pace to the next station. Upon arrival, he would immediately transfer his message to a fresh rider on a fresh horse, who would then gallop to the next link in the chain. This equine relay could cover distances that would break any single animal or rider, allowing news and orders to flow across thousands of miles with astonishing speed. Marco Polo, who traveled these routes, marveled at the system, noting that some urgent messages could travel up to 200 miles in a single day. But the Yam was more than just logistics, it was a legal and cultural institution. The Great Khan's law declared the Yam couriers and their mounts inviolable. Any interference with their journey was punishable by death. Local communities were required to support the stations, providing horses and provisions as a form of tax. This created a sacred channel of communication, a protected artery that pulsed with the will of the central authority, ensuring that even the most distant general felt the immediate presence of the Khan's command. Yet on the open battlefield, where armies moved like storms across the plain, a different kind of signal was needed. Historical sources, including Persian and Chinese accounts, describe the Mongols using specialized signal arrows. These were not just for shooting but for speaking. Some were designed to produce a distinctive, whistling sound as they flew, created by carving holes in the arrowhead or attaching a hollow bone tip. The shrill cry of such an arrow cutting through the air could convey prearranged commands to vast formations of cavalry, signaling a retreat, a flanking maneuver, or a general advance. In the chaos of combat, where shouted orders were lost to the thunder of hooves, this auditory signal cut through the noise. It was a language of warfare written on the wind, perfectly suited to a military doctrine built on speed, deception, and coordinated movement. While evidence for their use in long-range, cross-country signaling like beacons is less clear, the principle is compelling. On the featureless steppe, where visual markers were scarce, a high, piercing sound could carry for remarkable distances, potentially alerting scattered patrols or coordinating movements across a broad front. The whistle was the audible counterpart to the Mongols' famous mobility, a fleeting but precise command that could turn 10,000 horsemen as one. The true genius of the Mongol system, however, lay in its fusion of the permanent and the ephemeral. The Yam stations were fixed points, the empire's anchored nervous system, handling the complex, detailed traffic of administration. The whistling arrow was the temporary, tactical shout, the instantaneous reflex for the chaos of war. One provided deep, strategic control, the other granted lightning-fast tactical coordination. This combination allowed them to govern a continent without ever becoming stationary themselves. It proved that the imperative for rapid communication was universal, transcending the type of empire. Whether your power was rooted in stone walls, mountain roads, or the saddle of a horse, you still needed to make the land speak, and you still needed that speech to travel faster than any enemy could move. From the intricate quipus of the Andes to the beacon fires of Byzantium, and now to the whistling arrows of the steppe, we see a pattern repeated across time and terrain. Each civilization, faced with the tyranny of distance, engineered its own solution. But how do these diverse systems truly compare? What fundamental principles did they all share? And what can their collective success and their ultimate failure teach us about the nature of connection itself? A towering mountain range demands a different language than a whispering forest. Placing these silent communication systems side by side reveals a breathtaking truth. Each was a perfect, ingenious adaptation to the world it inhabited. Geography did not just influence these networks, it dictated their very form. In the vertical world of the Andes, where sightlines were broken by peaks and gorges, the Inca solution was kinetic. They built a network of human endurance, the Chasqui runner, paired with a portable, tactile code, the Quipu. The message moved with the messenger, conquering impossible terrain through sheer physical resilience and a not language you could hold in your hand. Contrast this with the sprawling, open frontiers of China or the high plateaus of Byzantium. Here, the horizon was a clean slate. These empires perfected line-of-sight optics, building chains of watchtowers that turned the landscape itself into a giant optical telegraph. Their solution was static and monumental, etching the network permanently into the earth with stone and fire. In the dense rainforests of West Africa, where vision was useless beyond a few yards, the solution was auditory. The talking drum used the forest canopy as a natural sounding board, turning the obstacle of the trees into a resonant channel for complex, tonal messages. Meanwhile, for a maritime power like Rome, whose lifeblood was the shifting surface of the sea, the tool of choice was reflected sunlight, the brilliant, directional flash of a heliograph that could cut across the waves to a specific ship or coastal fort. Each system solved the same core problem: how to shout across a kingdom faster than a person can travel, but the tools were as diverse as the landscapes themselves. This diversity is a masterclass in innovation within constraints. The Inca Quipu stands out for its radical data portability, a three-dimensional record-keeping system that made the empire's ledger books literally run. The Chinese beacon network, with its precise codes for 4 fires or colored smoke, represents the peak of bureaucratic codification, turning an urgent alarm into a standardized state-managed procedure. The talking drums of West Africa achieved something different altogether, a form of linguistic complexity that wove the very sounds of spoken language into rhythm, making the network an extension of daily speech rather than a secret military code. There was no single best solution, only the most appropriate one. A talking drum would be meaningless on the Great Wall, just as a beacon fire would be invisible in the Amazon. These civilizations looked at the world around them, at the mountains, the trees, the sea, and asked not how to defeat their environment, but how to make it speak. They listened to the constraints, and the constraints gave them the answer. This comparative view forces a profound synthesis. These silent whispers from the past, in all their varied forms, ultimately tell us two intertwined stories. The first is a story of power. Every network, from the Yam stations of the Mongols to the tambos of the Inca, was an instrument of centralization. It was the primary tool for shrinking a vast, rebellious geography into something a single ruler could perceive and control. The speed of light or sound became the speed of law, the velocity of imperial will. To build the network was to declare dominion, to physically manifest the idea that this land and its people were now part of a single, synchronized organism. The flicker on the horizon was the empire's pulse, visible to all, but woven tightly within that story of control is a second, more human narrative, one of connection. Before these systems could be tools of power, they were feats of shared imagination. They required a collective leap of faith, a society-wide agreement that a specific knot, a particular sequence of drumbeats, or a column of smoke at a certain time held a specific, vital meaning. They created a shared consciousness, a sense that distant events were relevant, that a community was part of something larger than its own valley. In their own ways, they sought to overcome the fundamental human loneliness of distance. They were early, brilliant attempts to answer a question we still grapple with today. How do we maintain a coherent society when we are spread so far apart? The silent systems suggest that the answer has always required both the hard architecture of towers and roads and the soft, fragile agreement of a common code. They remind us that every connection, no matter how advanced, is built upon a foundation of mutual understanding, and that the most enduring networks are those that listen to the world they are built within. These silent networks were not primitive steps toward the telegraph, but masterworks of their own age. They were the vital, beating heart of empires, technologies that actively shaped the course of history. With them, a ruler could project his will across a continent, making a distant governor feel the immediate weight of a command issued weeks before. Administrators could transform the chaos of a sprawling realm into orderly columns of data, recorded in knots or on scrolls, allowing them to allocate resources and levy taxes with a precision that fed the imperial machine. Most critically, armies could defend borders not just with walls, but with time, receiving warnings of invasion at the speed of sight, and mobilizing a response before an enemy had finished its march. The true measure of these systems was not in their simplicity, but in the strategic speed they granted, a velocity that defined the very possibility of rule over such vast distances. They offer us timeless lessons. First, that the deep human urge to connect, to overcome the isolating silence of distance, is ancient and powerful. It is not born from the Internet age, but from the Imperial age, from the fundamental need to know what is happening beyond the next hill. Second, that this drive for connection is often inextricably linked with the drive for control. Innovation flourished not merely from curiosity, but from the desperate necessity to govern, to secure, and to command. And finally, they showcase a breathtaking human ingenuity, an ability to look at a mountain, a forest, or a sea, and see not a barrier but a medium. They found ways to make the landscape itself carry their messages, to shout across peaks with fire and whisper across canopies with rhythm, all without uttering a single audible word. These networks were the invisible threads painstakingly spun that wove 100 distant provinces into a single tapestry called an empire. When we log onto our global digital network today, sending a message across oceans in an instant, we are not leaving that story behind. We are writing the latest, fastest chapter in the very same eternal story. The tools have changed beyond recognition, but the underlying impulse remains to connect, to know, and in doing so, to shape the world. Which of these ancient silent systems amazed you the most? Was it the Incas running messengers with their knotted cords, or the Byzantines' fiery pulse racing across the mountaintops? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more journeys into the deep mysteries of our shared past.